One of my favorite Christmas movies of all time and growing up is Home Alone. Come on, raise a hand if you've seen it. Raise a hand online if you've seen it. It's one of my all-time favorites, where Kevin McAllister, the young kid, gets accidentally left at home as the family goes on a vacation to Europe. Now, Kevin ends up battling some hilariously slapstick burglars in that film, and as your pastor, I can't condone everything that happens in Home Alone, and do not do the things that he did and drop full paint cans on your neighbors, because it doesn't work that way in real life, but it is a pretty hilarious movie. You know, I was a kid, and I would watch it, and I would take the VHS tape, remember those, and I would rewind it, and then I'd fast forward it all the way to the end, and I'd just watch the end part when he kind of wreaks havoc on the burglars. But last year, I watched it as a new parent. It was our first Christmas with our son Finn, and I got this totally different perspective of the movie. Say that word perspective with me this weekend. Perspective. I saw it from what I learned was the perspective of the screenwriter who wrote what would become the movie of Home Alone. His name was John Hughes, and in 1989, he was taking his family on a trip to Europe, and the night before they would catch their flight in the morning, it was just chaos in his household, and he was trying to pack everything, and he said this feeling hit him deep inside the gut, and he got what's called traveler's anxiety. He started to have that homesick feeling of, whoa, I'm going to be really far away from home in Europe, and I don't know how I feel about leaving home. In fact, even as I just said, traveler's anxiety, some of you are getting that feeling inside of your stomach right now because you know what it's like to get homesick. I remember I would get it when I'd go to camp for a week with my church growing up and left home. And I loved just getting home and finally back in the comforts of with my family and in my own bedroom and sleep in my own bed. I remember I got it when my parents dropped me off for college. Anybody get that? Where you get kind of homesick within the first night or the first couple weeks? Even if I still travel to an unfamiliar place, I get it. And researchers have found about 25% of people get it in a really extreme way. They get traveler's anxiety when they go to an unfamiliar place. And I think we all know that feeling of getting back to your front door and that feeling of home, where it's peaceful and it's everything you kind of want it to be. I mean, think about your front door for a moment. Maybe it was your front door as a kid, or maybe it's your front door now. Wherever your front door is, where you would feel that's the place I want to be. I feel like I'm at home. Maybe it's like one of these front doors that we have on stage right now. Maybe yours looks really different than that as a kid, or it looks really different right now. But that was the feeling that John Hughes wrote the screenplay about Home Alone. He says it's a parent's perspective of just wanting to be at home and how far he would go, the parents, and the crazy story along the way to leave everything else behind to get home to the one that was worth leaving everything else behind for. I want to welcome you to a brand new series that we're starting this weekend at Miracle City Church called I'll Be Home for Christmas. In this series, we're going to look at Christmas from a little bit of a different perspective. We're going to take a parent's perspective. We're going to take God's perspective. We're going to take a Heavenly Father's perspective and looking at Christmas. Because typically we think Christmas, we start with Jesus in a manger in Bethlehem. But if you know the big story of Christmas, that's actually towards the end of the movie. So we're going to rewind the VHS tape and kind of go all the way back to the beginning and learn what Christmas is all about. In Christmas, you'll find it starts pretty far away from the front door of home. I mean, I think you'll find as I tell these stories over these weekends leading up to Christmas Eve, you might have more in common with the story of Christmas than you ever thought. Because I think somewhere in your life and somewhere in my life, we're all facing that feeling of feeling far from home somewhere. I mean, some of you may be far from home literally in this city, and Christmas just kind of feels far from home. I mean, some of you are missing somebody this Christmas, and this will be the first Christmas or the first one in a long time with a seat missing at the table, and it just feels far from normal, and it feels far from home. I think others, you may think, well, my family just looks and feels different now. It's like not what I had planned for my life, and Pastor, like my whole life doesn't feel like I'm really at home. And some feel like that in your faith. And you may be here because it's December and you want to plug back into something. And man, we're so excited for what God has for you, especially in this series, because you may be feeling far from home and far from what your faith used to be. Or you used to be on fire for God, and it just feels so different now. You just feel a bit distant. And the question we're going to be exploring as we tell the big story of Christmas is, where is God when you feel really far from home? So today I want to give a message I've given the title to Christmas in Egypt. Christmas in Egypt. And if there was ever a person from the Christmas story who knew what it felt like to be far from home, it was a man named Joseph. And it's probably not the Joseph that you're thinking of. I'm not talking about the Mary and Joseph, the parents of Jesus. I'm talking about the Joseph 1,800 years before the Christmas story. His story is actually found in the book of Genesis. It's found in the book of Genesis over several chapters. And some of you have heard his story before about Joseph, and he had a father named Jacob, and he had a grandfather named Abraham. But some of you maybe are new to church, and you have no idea who this Joseph is, or you never really heard the whole Christmas story before. You thought it was just a baby in a manger in a Bethlehem, and then close Christmas and move on to January. It's an amazing story, I want to tell you, no matter how many times or if you've never heard this story before, about Joseph. Now, Joseph ended up in Egypt, in a pretty crazy place, because he wasn't even from Egypt. It's a crazy story how he got there. I mean, Joseph, he grew up in a land called Canaan because he had a dad named Jacob and he had a grandfather named Abraham. And one day, God came to Abraham and he made Abraham a promise. He said, I see all the problems in the world and I see the sin and the wickedness, but Abraham, I promise you, I'm going to come and do something about it, and it's going to all happen through your family. And Abraham would have a son named Isaac, and Isaac would have a son named Jacob, and Jacob would have 12 sons with 2 different women. Merry Christmas. It's already getting a little bit messy. When God said he would solve the problem of sin, we see that this pattern had been transferred and inherited into this family that Joseph's a part of. He's got 11 different brothers. His closest brother from his actual birth mother was named Benjamin, and then there were 10 other brothers, and they didn't actually get along that well. You know, Jacob was, he's an interesting father. He, most fathers don't pick favorites, right? It's not what you teach parents. Jacob did. Jacob had 2 favorite sons, and their names were Joseph and Benjamin. And one day, Jacob comes to his favorite son, Joseph, and he says, I have a famously colorful coat for you. And he gave it to Joseph. But it was more than just this fancy outfit that he gave to Joseph. It was a blessing that he put on Joseph. It was a double portion of the inheritance. He would get double the everything, double the bank account, double the land. And he gave it to Joseph. Typically, you'd give it to the firstborn son. But Joseph was a 17-year-old kid. He was the second youngest, and yet Jacob said, you're my favorite. I'll pick favorites, and I want you to have the double portion of blessing. You can kind of imagine how that made the other brothers feel. If you've got siblings, how would that make you feel if your parents went to the other kid and said, yeah, all of you, keep trying, but I really love this one. And Joseph didn't help that he had a dream a couple of nights before that, and he said, well, guys, I had this amazing dream that all of you brothers were bowing down before me. He's wearing this beautiful inheritance coat. And all the brothers decided they didn't really like that. And they didn't really want to deal with this and these other 2 kids from this other woman. And they decided to do something about it. So they took Joseph out into the countryside and they said, well, let's leave him for dead, because if he dies, then the inheritance will get passed on to another brothers. Merry Christmas. What a fun family. In Genesis 37, there's a brother named Judah. Say Judah with me this weekend. Judah. Judah said to his brothers, what will we gain if we kill our brother Joseph and we cover up his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother. He's our own flesh and blood. And his brothers agreed. What a nice guy. Judah. We're going to leave Joseph, our brother, for dead, But let's not do that. Let's sell him to some slave traders. And so some slave traders came across and they were headed to Egypt. And he sells them for just a couple bucks and deals with Joseph. And then Judah and his brothers go back to dad. They say, Jacob, do you recognize this really colorful coat? And they had kind of scratched it up and put blood on it. And Jacob, of course, recognized it. And he said, that's Joseph's coat. I just gave him that. And all of a sudden he starts weeping and crying. And before you know it, the family's planning a funeral. And the brothers, there's a big cover up. And meanwhile, Joseph is on his way to Egypt. Can you think of a more far away from home place? The family's in Canaan. They're in the land that God promised Abraham for the Israelites and his family to dwell. And now here's Joseph, the son of blessing, that's getting carted off to Egypt, left for dead by a family that said, you'd be better off if you were just dead away in a far off country. Now, we get traveler's anxiety. Right? We get that feeling of far from home, but how do you think Joseph felt? Getting sold into slavery in Egypt. I think for maybe some of us this morning, you do know what that's like. You do know what it's like to be completely abandoned by your family, and that's a tragic and a painful part of your story. But I think for all of us, man, we know what it's like to be wrong, don't we? We know what it's like when somebody betrays us. We know what it's like when somebody lies about us. I mean, you know what it's like to be sold out by your coworker before your boss, and you get penalized and they get rewarded. I mean, you know what it's like to be cheated on. You know what it's like to be gossiped about. And when those serious things happen to us, I mean, do you just sit there and you're like, oh, yeah, cool, this is great, this is awesome? No, we get angry. We get bitter. We take offense. We get really mad at the person we believe has wronged us. And we want justice when injustice is done towards us, don't we? And then here's Joseph on his way to Egypt. And let me just pull you out of the Bible story because this is a true historical story. I don't think there was one moment that Joseph woke up in Egypt and said, wow, this is really feeling like home now. I just love it in Egypt. I've totally forgotten that my brothers sold me out and left me for dead as a high school kid. And that I grew up an orphan, not knowing my parents in a very critical time in my life. Yeah, I bet you not a single moment he forgot about it. I mean, if I were Joseph, if you were Joseph, what are the questions that start coming to your mind? In the ways that you've been betrayed, the ways you've been wronged, what are the questions? Come on, let's be transparent this morning. It's Christmas after all. I think for me, I'd start having some questions for my brothers. If I would even refer to them as my brothers, leaving me for dead. Why did you do that? Why do you hate me? And then I think, man, I have some questions for God. Like, where are you in all of this? Why is my story that I'm ending up in Egypt of all places when you've made a promise for me to be with my family at home in Canaan, and now this is my life? God, like, where are you? Where are you in all of this injustice? You know, it's a fascinating story because it continues, and it continues in the most dramatic way as Joseph is in Egypt, not going to look for his brothers back in Canaan, but they actually walk through his front door. And he, at this point, has become the governor of Egypt. He's gone from a slave to being a manager of a household, and now he's actually the governor of Egypt. In Genesis 42, it says, then 10 of Joseph's brothers went down to buy grain from Egypt because there was a famine that had hit the land. But Jacob did not send Benjamin, Joseph's brother, remember his one brother from the other mom, with the others, because he was afraid that harm might come to him. Send the other brothers. We don't really care if harm happens to them. Just don't take Benjamin. So Israel's sons were among those who went to buy grain, for there was a famine in the land of Canaan. Now Joseph was the governor of the land, the person who sold grain to all its people. And when Joseph's brothers arrived, they bowed down to him with their faces on the ground. Now get this. They walk into the front door of the palace, and they bow down to Joseph, and they don't recognize him because, remember, they sold him off when he was a high school kid. And now he's in that culture. He probably looks really different, and they see this other person, and they think, well, this is the governor. This is the guy who has power, and they bow down because they're starving to death in Canaan. Now, if you were Joseph at this moment, what would you do? I mean, if it's me, let me just be vulnerable. There's two options here. Option number one, I take out vengeance on these so-called brothers and I get justice. Or option number two is I toy with them a little bit before taking out vengeance on these so-called brothers of mine. So Joseph comes up with this clever plan, and he tells them, I think you're actually spies, because he has a conversation, and they're like, well, it's like, how many brothers are there in this family? I need to provide food for you as the governor. And they're like, well, there's actually 11. And he's like, well, there's 10 standing in front of me. And they're like, no, our father really likes Benjamin. Benjamin's at home. And he's like, I don't believe you. You can't get your story straight. You're spies. Prison. And so he sends them to prison for 3 days, and then he calls them back out, and they come before him, and he says, okay, I'll cut you a deal. Here's the deal. You leave one of your brothers here, Simeon, we'll pick you, and he's collateral, and you can take all the food back to this so-called father and this so-called brother named Benjamin, but if you don't come back, Simeon's mine, leave him for dead. Comes up with this. He says, you leave this brother behind for dead, and I'll provide for you, give you all that you need. He wants to see, what are these guys going to do? The story continues. They go home, and Jacob comes back, and I imagine it's a little bit later, and he starts counting up his kids. He's like, one of you's missing. Who is it? Oh, it's Simeon. Where's Simeon? They're like, yeah, all right, little thing in Egypt. Simeon's still there because we met this governor, and he thought we were lying because you kept Benjamin back. And all we have to do, Dad, take Benjamin back to Egypt. And Jacob, whose name is Israel, Jacob, the beloved Jacob, the father, he says, yeah, I'm not doing that. Let's leave Simeon for dead in Egypt because I'm not giving up Benjamin. Benjamin is my beloved. And so they eventually eat through all the food, and it catches up with them, and they say, well, now we're all going to die. So would you rather us take Benjamin now and all of us just starve to death? Finally, Jacob says, fine, take Benjamin, but please, it's going to kill me if he doesn't come back. Guys, don't screw this up. So they go back, and they find Joseph. And they fall down at his feet, and they say, hey, here's Benjamin. Benjamin's back. And Joseph, he's so overwhelmed by emotion. I mean, wouldn't you? You see your brother, flesh and blood. And Benjamin comes back. He runs out of the room, and he just weeps, the Bible says. Just overcome with emotion and grief and everything. I mean, everything over the decades of his life is just found in that room. Joseph's weeping, and finally gets it together, goes back into the room. He says, okay, well, now I believe you. I've met this so-called Benjamin, and why don't you go back to your father? And he loads him up with food. But Joseph's not done yet. Joseph takes a silver cup, which doesn't mean much to us today. Think, Joseph pulls out his wallet, and he hides it in one of the sacks of food with his brothers that are going back home. And he tells his people, hey, here's what I want you to do. Give them a day, catch up with them, and I want you to search in these sacks of grain and food, and you're going to find something that belongs to me. I want you to arrest them and bring them back. And sure enough, this guy catches up with the brothers who's on these donkeys loaded up, and they open this grain, and they say, what are you doing with Joseph's wallet? This governor who you don't know, what's going on? Why did you steal from the governor? And the brothers are like, no. Did you do it? Did you do it? Did you do it? All are like, we didn't do it. We have no idea. But still, they're handcuffed, and they're brought back to Egypt, and they're thrown at the feet of this governor. Remember, Joseph hasn't revealed who he is. He's still toying with them. Joseph gives them one last chance. He says, you've stolen from me. You've done wrong against me, even though I did everything for you. So here's what I need you to do. You're going to leave Benjamin with me. This beloved son, you're going to leave him with me, and you're going to leave him to either be my slave or leave him for dead, but he's not going home with you. Would they do it? It's interesting. It says, one of the brothers steps forward. If there was ever a brother to step forward, who do you think it would have been? Probably the guy who did it before. It says Judah. Judah steps forward. I imagine Joseph, he's thinking, what is Judah going to do? I remember what he did to me. When that same scenario is put before him, you leave your brother Joseph for dead, and you make a few bucks, and you go back to dad, and you lie about it. Here's Judah who steps up again. What's he going to do? Here's what it says in Genesis 44. Judah says, your servant guaranteed the boy's safety to my father. And I said, if I don't bring him back to you, I will bear the blame before you, my father, all my life. Now then, please let your servant remain here as my Lord's slave in place of the boy. Let Benjamin return with his brothers. How can I go back to my father if the boy's not with me? No, don't let me see the misery that's going to come on my father. Judah tells Joseph, look, you don't understand. If my father doesn't have his son, it's going to kill him. We owe you a life. Take mine instead. It's an interesting transformation in Judah indeed. It says, then Joseph could no longer control himself before all his attendants, and he cried out, have everybody leave my presence. So it's just him and his brothers. So there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him, and Pharaoh's household heard about it. That's deep. That's emotion. And Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. He reveals himself. Is my father still alive? But his brothers couldn't even answer because their mouths were on the ground, because they were terrified at his presence. What's Joseph going to do? Then Joseph said to his brothers, come here, come close to me. And when they had done so, he said, I am your brother Joseph. Guys, you recognize me? I'm Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now, I imagine there's a pretty dramatic pause. And now, with everything you did to me, and now with everything you took from me, and now with everything my life has been, and now, here's what he says, don't be distressed and don't be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years there's been a famine, and for the next 5, there's going to be no plowing and reaping. It's going to continue. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then, it's not you who sent me here, but it was God. And he made me father to Pharaoh, lord of his entire household and ruler of Egypt. Translation, guys, I hope you can forgive yourselves, because I've already done it. I mean, let's be real. How does Joseph do that? I mean, this kind of feels like it's a Hallmark movie of a story. Like, at what moment did Joseph just forget about everything that had just happened, that his life was transported far from home in Egypt, and everything that his family had done to abandon him? Like, is this just some kind of Bible story that we think of where everything's going to end up neat and tidy in the end? It's like a Hallmark movie, and yay, Christmas, and let's pray. How did Joseph do that? Because this is a true story. This is historical. I mean, you got to understand that this story is actually all about Christmas. See, because 39 generations later, Jesus would come from one of the families of those 12 brothers. And if you don't have 12 brothers, you don't have 12 tribes of Israel. You don't have some serious prophecy and some promises that God made to Jacob's great-grandfather, or Jacob's grandfather, or Joseph's great-grandfather. 39 generations later, Jesus is going to come born in a manger. Without Joseph and his brothers, you don't get Christmas. There will be no Christmas. And yet this happened. And at a deeper level, I think this story shows us a window. It shows us a doorway into what Christmas is really all about. All those years ago. Let me ask you a question. In that story, true story, who do you identify with as a character in that story? Is it Joseph? Or is it, I don't know, a brother named Judah? I think for like 99% of us, we say, well, I'm Joseph. Right? Because I know a Judah or two from my life. Like I know a Judah that has a name. I have a boss. I have an ex. I have this person who has done me wrong, and I've got a Judah, and I'm Joseph. But here's the catch. If you really want to understand Christmas and you want to understand the story, you're not Joseph. You're actually Judah. And I'm actually Judah. You may say, Pastor, that's a stretch. I have never left my brothers for dead. I may have done some stuff when I was a kid that I'm not proud of, but like I never sold my siblings into slavery. I know. But sin is the cause of the brokenness in our lives and the brokenness of relationships that we see within a family and we see within our world. And sin is not an amount, it's an effect. And the effect of sin is spiritual death and brokenness and unrighteous. And we all stand unrighteous before a righteous judge like Joseph, who stands righteous before all the wrong of Judah. But actually, we're all Judah. And the only thing offered to us is we pay for our wrong, or somebody substitutes themselves in our place and says, I'll take it instead. And that's Christmas. You say, Pastor, you've mixed up Christmas and Easter, buddy. That's not the thing. No, that's Christmas. See, Christmas is a doorway. It's a doorway into the gospel. See, Jesus was born in a manger, but that's not where it stops. It culminates in a cross. It culminates in a resurrection. And if you just have Christmas, if all we're doing in Christmas is talking about a baby born in a manger, Christmas is just a nice religious tradition to remember somebody who taught some good things, maybe did a few signs and wonders, and that's why we kind of remember Jesus at Christmas, is because he was born and we just commemorate him. But that's not Christmas. See, Jesus didn't just come to us. He came to us to die for us. And Jesus was always really clear about this when he came. People would try to box him into just Christmas. And he would say, no, that's not what I'm actually doing here. Mark 10:45, Jesus says, for even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a what? As a ransom for many. He said, I've come to put my life in place of those who have screwed up and those who are really sinful and have broken everything. And that's what Jesus did. That's Christmas. Jesus became Judah so that Judah could be forgiven. And Judah could stand righteous as Joseph. And Jesus became you on the cross, born in a manger, culminated on a cross so that you could stand righteous like Joseph, even though we stand as Judah. And when the Father looks at your life by faith in Jesus, all he sees is a righteousness like Joseph. Isn't that amazing? See, Christmas, I think, is a doorway to forgiveness. That's what I want to unpack this morning from this story. It's amazing how much you're going to find it has to do with your life. Christmas is a doorway to forgiveness. I mean, Joseph is not literally Jesus. Jesus is the true and the better Joseph. As you trace the family line of Jesus back to those brothers, isn't it interesting that the great-great-great-great-uncle of Jesus is Joseph? But the great-great-great-great-great-grandfather of Jesus is Judah. Why? Because Jesus came for Judah. Jesus came for Judahs in the world. He came to substitute himself on a cross so that we could go free and stand righteous like Joseph. Isn't that amazing that the doorway of Christmas actually leads to forgiveness? That's the good news in your life. And you may be here this weekend and saying, I don't know how to forgive myself. I don't know how I can have forgiveness with God. Christmas is how you can have forgiveness with God. Because that God came. He was born in a manger, and he died on a cross for your sins and my sins. Isn't that good news this morning at Miracle City Church? The gospel, man, you see it through Christmas, don't you? Christmas also, I think, invites us not to just be forgiven, but it also says, hey, if you're going to be Judah, become Joseph, you got to act like Joseph. You got to be a forgiver. And this is where I want to say, oof. Somebody say, oof with me. Because that's probably not what we wanted to hear this morning. We actually have to be forgivers as well. And it's not just your pastor saying that. It's not just Joseph doing it. Look at Ephesians 4. It says, get rid of all bitterness, rage, anger, brawling, slander, along with every form of malice. You want to talk about things that Joseph could have been? Man, I think he's got a right to be those things. But then it says, be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other, just as in Christ God forgave you. See, here's the truth of what this is saying, then we're going to talk about what it means. The truth is that the same sufficiency God has forgiven you because of Christmas and the cross is true of anybody else, no matter what they have done, no matter the hurt that they have caused. And it's also true for your life. That's what it's saying. What Jesus did for Judah, he did for you. And as Joseph, you've got to turn to others and you've got to be a forgiver. It's like God nudging us and saying, hey, Joseph, remember when you were Judah? And we're like, yeah. He's like, that's not who you are anymore. You're Joseph. So now I need you to act like him. And you actually got to turn around and you got to forgive others, and you got to be rid of all this other stuff that we're sometimes full of at Christmas. The bitterness and the rage and the slander and the anger. You've got to turn around and forgive others. I love how C.S. Lewis put it. He said, to be a Christian means to forgive the inexcusable because God has forgiven the inexcusable in you. Now look at me and hear me. Forgiveness isn't forgetting. And some of you may say, that's great for Joseph, but you're tuning out because you say, you don't know my story, Pastor. You don't know what's been done to me. You don't know where I'm at. And I want you to know I see you this morning. I understand that you have a story and that what has done for you, I'm not trying to glaze over that or just say, oh, you know what you should do at Christmas? You should just forgive people. No, it goes deeper than that. But if this is true for Joseph, maybe you would dare to believe that God knows the depths of your pain, and he knows the depths of your sin as well and what it took to forgive you on the cross. I'm not saying you go and you get back together with them. I'm not saying you can necessarily have those same relationships. I'm not saying not to have wise boundaries. I'm not saying not to have Christian counseling. All that is good. But what this story seems to be pointing to is the hard truth that the forgiven have to be forgivers. If we want to stand righteous and be forgiven, we also got to stand as forgivers in our life. Oof, that one's hard too. How do we do that? What does this mean? And this is where Christmas gets really practical. This is where Christmas becomes not just a nice story, but Christmas starts to invade the depths of your life, into my life, and into our church and into our city. What does that mean? How does Christmas get practical? I think Christmas, it invites us to live and to forgive from God's perspective. Say that word with me again, perspective. Christmas from God's perspective. I think the Bible consistently tells us that God's ways are not our ways, that God's thoughts are not our thoughts. The way he sees things is oftentimes really different from the way that we see and the way that we perceive things. And the reason Joseph could just turn around and from honestly what we think is maybe a Hallmark ending where he could genuinely turn to his brothers that did all that and said, I've already forgiven you. I hope you can forgive yourself, is because at some point in Egypt, he must have started to believe and to see from God's perspective. And God's perspective is always about to see people not as who they are, but who they can become. That is always God's prerogative. I think and I find in people's stories and in their lives, there's two narratives. One of those narratives is what God believes about somebody. And it's God constantly and consistently interceding and fighting for the opposite of somebody's worst moment. That he would say, I can change and I can transform anything about their life, even Judah. There's a narrative that God already has written over your story and already has written over my story, over our church, over our city. And then there's another narrative. And I think that narrative is the enemy's narrative. It's Satan's narrative over our lives that says, who you are will always be the same. You'll never be enough. You'll never change. You will never get it right. In the battle of a Christian life is to say, who am I going to come into agreement with? Because God has a narrative over someone, and Satan has a narrative over someone, and you can't, here's the thing, listen to me with grace, you can't take a middle ground on this. And I think if you're honest with your heart, you'd say, yeah, that's true. I don't think I'm that neutral on anybody if I get radically honest with myself. There's the God narrative, and then there's the enemy's narrative. But I mean, think of God's narrative for Judah. Judah, of all people, leaves Joseph for dead, lies about it, plans a funeral, and washes his hands clean. And yet God's narrative for Judah was, Judah, I can change you so significantly from the inside out that from your family there will come a Savior named Jesus, and your life is going to look a lot like his. I'm actually going to bring you and change you to be so meek and so sacrificial that instead of leaving your brother for dead, you are going to offer your life to save your brother. You would say, what in the world? How did he do it? And God did it. There's God's narrative over life. There's the enemy's narrative over Judah's life that says, Judah, you'll always be a murderer. You'll never get past that. You can't forgive yourself. God wouldn't probably even forgive a sin that bad as leaving your brother for dead. And so I don't want you to do it. But here's God and saying, no, Judah, I'm fighting. I'm fighting for my transformative narrative in your life. I mean, think of Joseph. Joseph's not perfect. But here's Joseph, who's sold into slavery, has all that done against him. And you know what I bet God is fighting for? The narrative over his life is, Joseph, you will not be bitter. You will not be a person of offense. You're not going to grow up far away from home in Egypt and just be this guy that always is a victim and everything was done against you, even though there's truth to what was done to you. I'm going to raise you up to be so meek and so humble that you are going to look like my son Jesus when he shows up at Christmas, that you would even take an enemy and you would reconcile them to the Father because of how you are walking in mature love. Joseph, that's what I'm going to do in your life so that when your brothers come back, you will immediately have already forgiven them because you have bought into the narrative that I have over your life, and you're going to walk in that greatness. And for thousands of years, people are still going to talk about you. They're still going to talk about the way I changed your life, even this weekend at a church called Miracle City. How about that? I think God, and I know God has a narrative for you. And the question is, which one do you believe in? Because God has a narrative over your life, and it's not your worst moment, and it's not your biggest screw up, and it's not your grandest sin. God has a narrative, and it's seen through the doorway of Christmas that he loves you. You are beloved. He's calling you to walk in humility. He's calling you to walk in meekness. He's calling you to be radical forgivers. I think God's got a narrative over our city, and we as a church, we buy into it. I think you can buy into the enemy's narrative like Minneapolis is done for, and there's nothing good that'll ever come from Loring Park, and what are you doing planting a church on 14th and Nicollet? And yet we choose to come into agreement and step into God's narrative and said there is a plan for Minneapolis. The best days are actually ahead, they're not behind, and that Jesus can take any situation and redeem it and turn it into something that looks like his son Jesus. That's what we're believing for our city. This is what we're believing for the church. We don't buy the enemy's narrative that the church is just a wicked, evil place. We don't look at the sins and gloss over them. They're real. But we serve a God who forgives, and we choose to come into the God narrative of the church and say it's his bride, it's his beloved. He said it's going to be without spot or wrinkle or blemish. And if Jesus can do that in my life, boy, I believe he's going to do it in his church. And we choose to come into agreement with God's narrative over the church and over our lives and over our city. This is transformational. And I think this is just your pastor talking. I think this story, it shows us there's two kinds of forgiveness that we can have in our life. I think there's the transactional forgiveness, which is good. Please don't hear me saying anything wrong with forgiving the debt that is owed you. That's what forgiveness is. It's saying you owe me a real debt, and I'm not going to cash in on it. And that's a good thing. But I think oftentimes we can stop there, and we can say, okay, transactional forgiveness, now I'm done. And it's kind of like when you go to the store and you check out, you're not going to hang around there talking with people. You're just done. You're going home. How often do we do that in our lives and say, I've forgiven you, but boy, do I not believe in you. I've forgiven you, but I actually believe what the enemy says about you, that you're not going to change and that nothing's ever going to get better. Again, don't hear me saying that you shouldn't have boundaries. That's all good. But sometimes I think that the struggle in our lives as followers of Jesus is that we stop at the transaction. And yet what Joseph did is so amazing, because Joseph did what I would call transformational forgiveness. And transformational forgiveness, it means seeing from such a different perspective that you can even forgive in agreement with God's narrative over someone, even when you don't see it before your eyes, even when that person's still being a jerk. Even when that person still wronged you and they haven't owned up to it, you can say, no, God, I'm coming into agreement with what you are going to do and the power of your Spirit in their life. I'm actually going to forgive for transformation, not just for transaction. You say, how do you do that? I believe transformational forgiveness takes believing who somebody can become. Transactional forgiveness, it starts with what somebody has done. But transformational forgiveness starts from believing who somebody can become. It's buying into that narrative. And I think this is the struggle of following Jesus. Because, come on, can we all agree Jesus was a transformational forgiver? Jesus never just transacts forgiveness and says, cool, you're in the family. No, he says, you're a son and a daughter. Step into the fullness of the blessing of my family. I will transform you from the inside out. He justifies by becoming the judge, but then he sanctifies by filling us with his Spirit. But I think the challenge is when people have hurt us really bad, when people have wronged us, when Judah shows up into our life, yeah, we can forgive them. We can transact some forgiveness, but I'm not going to come into agreement with what God can do in their life. That's really hard. Start believing over the person who has wronged you. No, God can actually change you from the inside out. I think sometimes, dose of reality, we don't understand how self-defeating that is, because what's the one thing you want that person to stop doing? Stop being mean to you. Stop mistreating you. Stop being a bully. Stop being a jerk. Stop cheating on you. And then you come into this transactional forgiveness where you just come into agreement with the enemy that they're never going to change. And then they don't change, and you're like, wow, see, I told you they're never going to change. Or you can come into agreement with Jesus over their life, over your city. Why not? Why not partner with what God could do in someone's life? And I would answer my own question and say, because that's hard. That doesn't feel good. That's not my first reaction. That is not what I want to do to Judah. I want justice. And it's hard for me to look at the cross and say, all justice was paid on the cross, so I've got to forgive. I'm not telling you this morning that you've got to go forgive people. The Bible will tell you that. I want to ask you a different question. I want you to wrestle with this in your home groups. I want you to capture this truth from Christmas in your heart and begin to dialogue and intercede with the Lord. I don't want to ask you who you need to forgive. Let me ask you a better question. Who do you need to start believing can change in your life? Who's someone who is so far from God, so far from home, that you've stopped believing they can change? That's how you become a transformative forgiver. And it starts by simply asking God. Here's what you can do this week. Ask God, show me how you see them. Show me how you see your church. Show me how you see your city. Show me how you see my block. Show me how you see my neighbor that keeps me up till 3 a.m. every night. Show me, Lord, show me how you see my mom, my dad, my grandparents, the people who, man, you never knew you had so much in common with Joseph. God, would you show me that? And then you simply just say, God, I agree with your narrative over their life. I'm not even telling you, you got to believe it. Because believing sometimes comes later. You just need to say, God, I'm agreeing with what you can do in their life. And I think you'll find as you continue to pray, as you continue to intercede, man, I bet Joseph was at it for decades with his brothers. He must have started a long time before they arrived in Egypt to get to the point where he can say, no, I see it. If God could bring good out of the bad of my life, he can do it in you, Judah. I was just waiting for you to show up and waiting for you to come through the front door. Let me wrap up with this. Worship team, when you come join me. The story ends in a really unexpected way. He says, now hurry back to my father and say to him, right? They're all in Egypt. They're all in that room together. He says, here's what I want you to do. Go back to dad. Go get Jacob. And here's what I want you to say. This is what your son Joseph says. Joseph is alive, Dad. God has made me Lord of all Egypt. Come down to me. Don't delay. You shall live in the region of Goshen and be near me. You, your children, your grandchildren, your flocks, your herds, pack up all your bags. We're all moving to Egypt. And then the story continues. And I say, wait a second. Why aren't we going back to Canaan? Why aren't we going back to the promised land? Why aren't we going back to the front door of home? Why aren't we all going back there? Well, Joseph would say there's no food. There's going to be a famine for another five years. But Joseph would also say, I think God's taught us something about home here. And yeah, guys, we're all going to be really far away from what we thought home was going to look like. But isn't it amazing that God was never that far away from them? And I want you to know that truth this morning, that you might be feeling or actually really far from God and far from what home feels like. But God is not far from you. And I think this story shows it, because Christmas is coming. And Christmas is when God is going to burst through the front door of the whole world, and he's going to forgive, and he's going to change the forgiven into the forgivers. But I told you from the beginning, it's a crazy story, and it's going to take a couple thousand years, and it's going to take some other stories of people who were really far from home, but they were never far from God.